Greetings and welcome to part 3 of the introduction to my video series, How Not to Do Business. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And in part 1 of this introduction, I discussed my homelessness in the context of how it led me to work for the truck wash that I'm using as a real-world model for this series on how not to do business. In part 2, I discussed the operations of a truck wash, and in particular, this truck wash. And I explained all the red flag, well, not all, but I listed out many of the red flags that I saw as I worked there. And I emphasized that had I not been homeless, I would have been gone. I would have been gone from that place. But because I was homeless, I was unable to. And that had a big impact on me personally and specifically on my ability to get out of homelessness. In part 3 here, toward the end of that last section, part 2, I ended up talking about Mr. H, the owner of this business, quite a bit. And in part 3 here, I'm going to elaborate on Mr. H and his impact on why his business was failing. Because the fact is, the uncaused cause of this business's failure is Mr. H. Throughout most of the time I was there were 2 employees. Sometimes there were 3, usually 2. And Jethro and myself, either one of us could run the business ourselves if we had to. Didn't mean it was going to be the most efficient thing in the world. But if one of us had to go somewhere for an appointment or lunch or whatever, the other one could run the whole place. Mr. H owned he was involved in other ventures, I should say, particularly dealing with car washes. So he came in at unpredictable and bizarre hours, and as it turns out, whatever hours he told us he was going to show up, he never did, because he was totally unreliable in that regard. And he would stay for strange lengths of time. His agenda for being there was really bizarre, and you're going to get a sense of that from this. So, you really need, because there's only 3 people really, for the most part, throughout the time I was there, who dealt with this business. You really need to understand why Mr. H was the uncaused cause of why this business is failing. But not just why it's failing, but why everyone associated with the business got hurt. Some people very badly, such as myself, where, frankly, my life is at risk at this point. And if you recall, when I first started working there, even though I was only making $9 an hour starting, I immediately made a budget, I made a plan, and I had planned to be out of Minnesota by the beginning of October, and I left it open that it might be a month later, but by the beginning of October, with enough money to go get an apartment, even paying a month ahead, if need be, to get into an apartment in another state. Excuse me. And then once I have an apartment and hygiene is taken care of, getting a job is pretty simple. And it was Mr. H exclusively who didn't just throw a monkey wrench in there. He threw a hand grenade here, and a nuclear bomb there in my plan to get out of there. And it was the same kind of behavior that led to him running his business into the ground. And again, he's still in business as of the time I left a few weeks ago, but it's not going to be that way for long. He can only prop himself up for so long. Now, you're going to encounter people with this personality type in your business dealings, most likely. I don't think you're going to find someone this extreme. I certainly never have. I've met people sort of this genre, and they're always a monkey wrench in the works, but I've never met someone this extreme. That's one reason. It's one of the things that inspired me to do this video series, is that the sheer extremeness of what happened here was so ludicrous. It was just so absurd and frankly impossible. If someone had just told it to me in words in a story, I would think they were embellishing or exaggerating or something, because it doesn't make any sense that someone like this could even get a business rolling. Who would give him a business loan. Who would do anything like that for someone like this who is, just pointed like a laser beam at failure and just making a beeline for it. And I, you're going to kind of see why this is. A lot of it has to do with him. He had his own support system that was going to allow him to do that. He, as I found out later, too late, was in association with the Redneck Mafia. And it's my personal belief that the Redneck Mafia was using him and that they're going to chew him up and spit him out if he ever were able to fulfill this dream of his of getting this machine running. But that's not going to happen anyway. So he's probably going to get chewed up and spit out the real hard way. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, as I'm going through this personality type, think about the people you work with who are like this and be on the lookout for this in the future. Mr. H pretty much destroyed everything and everybody he touched. And yet he did it with this huge smile and this salesman-like boisterous friendliness and cheerfulness, which frankly made people pretty uncomfortable. It wasn't natural, if you know what I mean, like a salesman or someone who's just happy all the time. That's not natural. I mean, life goes up and down, business goes up and down, and there was something wrong here. But again, I was homeless. I had to have this job. I had a plan to use this job to get out by October, and I thought, by the time I figured out that this business was a lost cause, I still thought I could just tough it out and get out. But he threw so many monkey wrenches in there, it destroyed my ability to get out. So when I first started writing out my notes, I ended up with 18 pages of notes specific to how Mr. H ruined his own business and the people around him. And, as an exercise, I actually, for a few of my old supervisors and mentors at the businesses I worked for previously, which ran real well, or, certainly comparatively well, I tried doing that with them in terms of what they would do that would really, maybe hurt the business. And, the best I could do, a couple of statements, and they weren't big deals. I mean, everyone has something where I guess they throw a monkey wrench into a company. I'm sure I do too. I mean, I'm not going to say I don't. Of course I do. But they usually don't destroy a company. You work around them, you work with them, you learn, you grow, you change, but that isn't happening with Mr. H. And there's pretty strong evidence that this has been this way for a long, long, long time with him. So if you're going to understand why the truck wash is an example of how not to do business, you have to understand who it is who is running the business that way. And that is Mr. H. Now, Mr. H, on the one hand, made it perfectly clear he's the owner, he's the boss, he's in charge, he calls the shots, but he would never say anything along the lines of, the buck stops with me. Because, again, if anything went wrong, he pushed responsibility and accountability onto other people. He would blame other people, other things. I don't know if I ever heard him just say, I'm sorry, or I was wrong, or anything of that nature. Well, okay, there was one time. There should have been hundreds, based on what you're going to see. And I think his wife told him to say that when he said it the one time. So I have to get some preliminaries out of the way so that you understand again what was going on with this truck wash. I think I alluded to this in the previous video. When I started working there, I was sleeping in my car at the truck stop, which is next door to the truck wash, adjacent to it. And so I started working there, and I would go sleep where I had been for several months at the truck stop. And it was I'm not going to say fine, but I mean, I was used to it by then. There was nothing unusual about it for me. Mr. H, as it started getting warm out, he encouraged me to, he made this offer, why don't you move your car into the wash out bay, which is the big empty bay without the rails, lots of room in there. Why don't you move your car in there at night and sleep in your car in there? And I really did not want to do that. I didn't see the point. I was already used to sleeping at the truck stop. The main benefit was that I would finally get privacy, which is something I'd never had since I was homeless. I wouldn't have the police coming up behind me all the time with their intimidation tactics. But I really didn't want to do it because I didn't want one person having that much control over my life, both my job and my sleeping arrangements. But it did get really warm. In fact, it kind of feels like that right now. Very sweaty. There's no real way to sleep in a car when it gets that warm, but you can't open your windows too far either, or else you become vulnerable. Someone can reach in and take your stuff or open the door. You know, you're caught between a rock and a hard place. So eventually, I don't know how long it took, but I took him up on that offer. And I was sleeping in my car in the washout bay. Now, then, towards summer, it started getting hot. Not just warm, but hot. And even in the washout bay, it was hot. And I mean hot. All I could do was sweat. I mean, you know, not even wearing a shirt. I was just sweating. My seat is probably filthy from that. And Mr. H then encouraged me, well, why don't you come into the store? We'll get you a cot. And Jethro loaned me his cot. Why don't you sleep behind the counter in the store? And again, I didn't want to do that. I never asked for it. It's not that I don't accept help when it's offered to me, but again, there was too much control from one person, in this case, over my life. But again, the heat really kind of inspired me or forced me to do it, and I thought it would be okay. You know, it was very gradual at how I learned what Mr. H was really like. So I did end up ultimately sleeping inside the customer service area behind the counter. Now, when I was there, it was not fun because I had to hide the whole time I was there. The police would circle around outside. As it turns out, this place had previously been the center of a drug ring and a prostitution ring, is what I've been hearing from people out there. So the police would drive around and look for any movement or motion in there. Also, the redneck mafia, the people who own the building, and at first when I started sleeping in here, I did not know that they owned the building. I thought Mr. H had bought the whole thing. But these guys were pretty creepy. You know, again, this word creepy comes up a lot in this story, and they would drive these pickup trucks around and be looking inside, and it was just really weird. So when I was sleeping in there, I was hiding behind this counter, basically 16 hours a day or however much I was there, and then I'm working the other 8, or actually I'm working 8, 9, 10, 11, depends what day. So what I'm getting at is that Mr. H encouraged me to come in there and sleep in the bay and then sleep in the store, and yet he had no authority to do so because he didn't own the building. The redneck mafia did. And that put me in a situation that I didn't even know I was getting into, which is where these guys in the redneck mafia could find out about it and say, you know, throw him out, get him out of there. We don't want him staying there. Now, I don't know if they would, but that was a possibility. Okay, whereas previously what Mr. H had told me was that it was more or less up to him. He had never said anything about someone else having control. And he made the offer, so I wouldn't expect him to do something like that. But more importantly, over time, he used this against me as he did with everything else that he called charity. He was very boastful about his charity and his kindness toward me. And, for example, he, you know, after a while, when I'm staying there for a while, he started saying things like, you know, well, I'm letting you stay in here, you know, I think you should, you know, mop the floors and clean the bathrooms. And he's talking about off the clock when I'm outside of work. And, you know, again, that sounds fine. As it turns out, in those cases, those are things I like to do anyway because I like clean. Any place I've worked, no matter what my level of duties are, I'm not afraid to get into janitorial duties because I just, you know, I'm not a clean freak by any stretch of the imagination. Look where I live. But I enjoy cleaning. I like seeing things go from disorder to order. You know, and that's true with a business or the cleanliness of the place where I'm at. So I didn't think so much of that, and I was frankly already doing it just on my own initiative, mopping. Like I said, I bought my own mop and supplies and things. But it was kind of weird that he would suddenly bring this up as if it were something we had agreed upon to begin with. You know, I'll let you stay in here if you serve as kind of a, what do you call it, a caretaker of the place. He never said that. He never said a word about that. He just said, you know, why don't you come and stay in here? I hate and the way he put it was, I hate thinking of you sleeping out there in that car. So it sounded very generous. But then it started getting into other things where because he would show up at bizarre times, off hours, I would end up kind of getting shanghaied into doing things either with him or for him, or, as I said earlier in the unwritten job description, just servicing his ego. In other words, just on my off hours, he would show up, and then out of the clear blue sky, I end up with, a half hour or an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours of listening to him talk and talk and talk, and I can't get away. And that ate into my personal time, and my time was the only asset I had in terms of clarifying what my plan was to get out of there, my plan to get out of homelessness, working on projects, trying to deal with things I have to deal with in my life. And he kept increasingly interrupting those things and doing it in very bizarre and unpredictable ways. And that had a big impact on me. Also, when I first started working there, I said, one of the red flags, when I asked him how much I was going to be paid, he said, well, and this is almost verbatim, well, it starts out at $9 an hour, and then you get raised to 10, and then 11, then 12, and then. And that's what he said. But the fact of the matter is that he raised me fairly quickly to 10. I mean, he saw how good I was immediately. There was no doubt about that. Then he raised me to 11, and then I stayed at 11 for the duration of the time I was there, even as Jethro was making 15, even as the people he hired, or at least one of the people that I know what he was paid, was hired in at $11 an hour. And at some point in this, as I was sleeping there, Mr. H suddenly, out of nowhere, it was, we had the 5-week shutdown for painting, and everyone lost half their pay because Mr. H cut our hours. And we had no advance warning of this, and that's what obliterated. I had that step-by-step plan of saving money, getting these things done, and then just saving the rest, and then I'd be good to go before winter. And that 5-week shutdown and half pay obliterated that. I made it all the way to July. Everything's right on target. I mean, just right on target, and then bam, just fell through the floor. And in fact, it ended up costing me money. And, at some point, and everyone raised that issue with him, and he didn't want to talk about it. Again, he wouldn't take responsibility for anything. He tried to pass the blame off on other people, or just avoid talking about it at all. And at some point, something came to a head, and we were talking about it, and I said, look, if this had not happened, I would have been fine. I had a plan. Everything was going perfect. I was going to be out of there. I was going to be out of homelessness. End of story. That's just the way it was going to be. And that 5-week shutdown destroyed this. And then, for the first time ever, and he'd never said anything about this before, he said, well, you're working part-time. You know that. You're working, this is a part-time job. Now, the thing is, of course, he'd never said a word about part-time. I mean, we're open 9 to 5. I worked on Saturdays. I was working 50, close to 60 hours a week if there wasn't a holiday or something. There was no part-time about it. Now, he never specifically said it was full-time, but it sure was, in terms of the number of hours. And so all of a sudden he said, well, this is part-time, and, because you're staying here, because you're sleeping inside, I haven't raised you above $11. If you go out and get a place of your own, then I'll raise you. And again, he had never said a word about this. He encouraged me to come sleep inside when I didn't want to. And he said at the time, and this is the thing about Mr. H, he'll say one thing this day and another thing the other day and a third thing the third day. He says whatever's convenient to say. And most people would call that a liar, a deceiver. And that's exactly what I was dealing with here. And right there you can kind of see the origins of why this business was going to fail. You can't do that to people, and you can't do that in your business dealings. So, out of nowhere, he suddenly came up with this thing where he just tells me, well, how do I get a place to live on $11 an hour? That's impossible. I don't know what he's even thinking. Even if I could, I was trying to get out of Minnesota, and he knew that from day one. I had made no bones about it. I said from the beginning, I want out of Minnesota, because the reason I became homeless had a lot to do with the corruption in Minnesota. I had never ever once even entertained the idea of staying in Minnesota. So for him to say, you know, well, you should go out and, you know, get a lease on $11 an hour, and this was something brand new that he came up with. Again, to cover his tracks, because he didn't want to talk about how he had stiffed us for those 5 weeks where we got half pay with no advance notice that it was going to happen. And then, of course, later on when he put an ad in the Craigslist to hire another person, he put in there, I have a quote here somewhere, but it said basically full time. It said 40 hours plus overtime plus rotating Saturdays, basically full time. So in that case, he switched back from part time to full time. See, he just says whatever he needs to say at any given moment, and if it sends someone else, another person, someone who is not him, off into a realm or a plan or a belief that is not consistent with reality, then Mr. H doesn't care, because it's all about Mr. H. Other people don't matter except in the sense that they serve him. And that's, I guess, what I'm getting at here, is that in terms of all this, in terms of him encouraging me to come in and sleep there, and his only reason he ever gave for that was, I just feel terrible thinking about you sleeping out there. I just hate the idea of you sleeping out there. And that was it. That's all he ever said. And yet, look what it turned into over the months. It turned into me basically being on call 24 hours a day. It turned into him showing up at really bizarre hours, often without any notice, and even if he gave me notice, he never showed up when he said he was going to. So he might say he's going to get there at 7 at night, and I'll wait, and he won't show up till 9:30 or 10 or something like that. You know, so it just obliterated my spare time off when I wasn't working. The pay never kept raising the way he had indicated it would in the beginning, and then he makes up this reason why it didn't. All of a sudden he's expecting me to basically be a caretaker, mop and clean and all that. And that was the least of my worries, because I like doing that anyway. Not a huge deal. But when you put all that together, what you end up with is something along the lines of, let's face it, indentured servitude. Or some people might call it human slavery. This guy basically saw me as his own pet human being. He slowly wrapped a leash around my neck. He had locked me in there. I could leave at any time, but what was I going to leave to? I was going to leave to back sleeping in my car at the truck stop, where it was impossible to get a job because I had no hygiene. The truck wash had showers, hygiene. And I was not going to be able to do anything. I was going to go back to where I'm preparing to die, which is where I was immediately before right at the time I got this job. So basically, he more or less enslaved me over time. And the only reason the reasons I put up with it was I had to survive day by day, but also I kept thinking I could tweak my plan, I could change this, I could try to compensate, I might have to stay through the winter, which is going to be terrible, but eventually I've got to save up enough money to get out of here. And of course that didn't happen, everything blew up later. But also in that, you're dealing with things like sleep deprivation and sleep interruption. I had people with keys to that building. I would be asleep and people would just show up and the place would turn into a tornado of activity with no warning. I was at the point where I was just shaking, and I just sleeping with one eye open. I was afraid to go to sleep because I didn't know what I was going to wake up to. And my fight or flight response was just triggered over and over and over again by this kind of thing. So then lastly, you have that thing I mentioned in the last video, and you have to understand what this is. Again, when you're homeless, you have no privacy. Right this moment, anyone can come up to this car. Anywhere I go, people can come up to me. I cannot get a moment of privacy. There's nowhere to go. And the main good thing about coming to sleep inside the truck wash for me was to have privacy. No more cops pulling up right behind me trying to intimidate me. No more waking up and having soccer moms filming me with their kids standing right there thinking it's funny to film the homeless person and probably put it on YouTube. No more of that nonsense. No more of having to watch the drug dealers and the prostitutes doing fantastic business while the cops pass right by them and come and worry about me instead. No more of that. and just have some privacy where I can sit and I can think, and it just feels good when you can shut other people out. You know, I mean, and people take that for granted when they're in a home. So that was the best part about coming into that business. Well, then what did I find out later? And again, I alluded to this in the last video. I found out that one of the main reasons for Mr. H's obsession with these surveillance cameras was because he was watching me from his home while I'm in the truck wash, off hours, over these cameras. You know, like, and you can picture it as him pulling up a bottle or a bowl of popcorn, maybe calling the kids in. You know, hey kids, look what's on TV today. Let's watch Paul. You know, the guy said, he came right out and said, you know, I've watched you sleep at 3 in the morning on the cameras. And also, he often used the cameras as a threat, or he thought he did. So if we weren't sure about something, we had a dispute with a customer, or get into a fight with a customer. I mean, these are truck drivers, right? This isn't normal customer relations. There were some pretty brutal things that went on. And, you know, something happens, or just he couldn't figure out what we didn't get punched in and out correctly, so he needed to know when we were there. He would always say, you know, well, I can always look at the cameras, you know. I can always look at the video, because it's stored it on video. He could go look at it. But he always said it in a very threatening way, as if, I'm watching you all the time, and anytime I want to, I can go look at those cameras. That's what he's saying. Now, I couldn't have cared less about that at work, because I'm not doing anything I'm worried about him seeing. But when I'm off hours and I'm on my own, and all I really did was, you know, I'd sit down there behind the counter. I was on my computer, I'd watch videos and maybe try to do some writing or something, listen to music, and then go to sleep. I mean, I really didn't have a life all those months because I was stuck behind that counter. But the thought of this guy watching me sleep, again, the word creepy, there is no other word. This is getting off into, you know, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer territory. This is not what you expect in your workplace, let me put it that way. And it's not a behavior you expect from a boss. And just in terms of humanity, it's not the behavior you expect from someone who is portraying themselves, boasting actually, of how they are doing something so generous and charitable for you. See, every time he did something that he said was for me to help this homeless guy get out of homelessness, I would find out that it was in fact something that he's doing for his own purposes. So that's what you're dealing with Mr. H. And I point that out because it tells you more about the story of me being homeless, and now you can kind of understand why I was not able to get out of homelessness even after working here for so long. Because I'm getting paychecks, right? And I do have expenses, but I don't have rent, so why couldn't I save enough money over that time? Well, this has a whole lot to do with it. And the thing is, the very same behaviors I'm describing here, and again, the word creepy has to be in there all the time. Those are applied equally to the way he dealt with customers, the way he dealt with us as employees, the way he dealt with the redneck mafia, the way he dealt with everything. So again, you can kind of see why this was how not to do business. So again, when I first started writing this out, I had 18 pages of notes on Mr. H. When I first recorded this, it was 3.5 hours long, and I could have kept going as long as I wanted to. And it shouldn't be that way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fly through a bunch of things, and I'm going to edit the daylights out of this thing if I have to. So I apologize if you get some jump cuts in the video. It's just because I can't keep recording this over and over and over again. This is the hardest video I've ever recorded because there's so much that Mr. H did that was irrational and offensive and, in my opinion, just plain dangerous. I really came to fear this guy, and you can kind of see why already, but there's a whole lot more to it. This guy scared the daylights out of me toward the end. He is not... He's not the stable, responsible, professional kind of person I'm accustomed to dealing with. Let's put it that way. So let me fly through these things. I'm trying not to duplicate what I'm saying in other videos, but you need to know this because as I get into the other videos about different departments like accounting and cash controls and environmental health and safety, I'm even going to attempt supply chain. There really wasn't one for a truck wash, but I'm going to try to go through all these departments that a company has. I have to refer ultimately to how Mr. H blew it, because even though he wouldn't admit it, the buck did stop with him. He's the boss, he's in charge, he calls the shots, he would clearly state that. And even though he wouldn't take responsibility for things, it was his responsibility. Along those lines, I should also say, when I came in there, part of my plan wasn't just to save money and go through these steps and then have enough money to leave in October. It was also, he had just taken over the business. I thought that he wanted it to be successful. And so I thought, well, here's a chance. I've got all these skills. I mean, I have skills in all these different departments: marketing, revenue management, customer service. I can really help out, and that would show my gratitude to him for giving me a job. And it would build my resume, because then when I go to get a job, I can say, well, I fell on some hard times. I became homeless. But look what I did. I got a job, manual labor. I wasn't afraid of the hard work after sitting in an office for 20 years, even at my age. And look what I did. I did all these things to help get this new business that had been failing under previous ownerships, to get it to where it was up and running and profitable and smooth running. And that would be a feather in my cap, again, to help me get a really good job when I get out of homelessness. But I wasn't able to do it because Mr. H didn't like other people being competent. It was like he was jealous of it or something, and he would never avail himself of my skills. There were a couple instances where he called upon it. He really didn't have a choice, like the website. He didn't have the foggiest idea how to do that. But he wouldn't avail himself of that opportunity, and therefore I lost that opportunity. That was one of the big things I lost in terms of helping me get out of homelessness, and not just out of homelessness, but back into a responsible, job later. Not washing trucks in some other state or something like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, if Mr. H had been stable and reasonable and rational person, if he'd been competent in business, then at the time I had planned to leave, and I ended up leaving actually a couple weeks after that, but at the time I had planned to leave and comfortably and leave out of state, he had owned the place for 10 months and I had worked there for 7.5. If he had been competent, he would have had an organized business, smooth running, profiting, with a good reputation, happy customers who were well served. They were getting what they needed. And I would, of course, right now, instead of recording these videos, I would be in another state. I would have a place to live instead of being in this car still as winter approaches or begins. It's going to snow tomorrow. And I would be in a much better job, building my life back. That's where we would have been if he had been reliable, dependable, stable, reasonable, rational, a good business person. So where are we instead? Well, his business is floundering. It's failing. He hasn't turned a profit yet. The reputation that place has is so bad. I'm not sure I've ever seen a business with a worse reputation. His customers are not just unhappy, many of them are furious. I mean, just the anger in these people is astounding. And they don't have any choice in many cases but to go to that because he doesn't have competition. They are poorly served. Their needs are not being met, and those needs often are crucial to them doing their own business properly. And of course, I am in fact in this car at the beginning of winter, still in Minnesota with not a penny to my name at this point. Lost everything I'd worked for the last 7.5 months because of the way he jacked around with my pay and things like that. That's where we're at because of Mr. H. It wasn't because of Jethro. It wasn't because of me. It wasn't because of the Redneck Mafia. It was because of Mr. H. And that is how not to do business. So let's take a closer look at him. Just one other quick note here. I mentioned it in the last video, so I'll just remind you, he had 2 obsessions. One was with that machine, that thing that would go over the trucks and lay down soap and then rinse. absolutely obsessed with working on it, trying to get it to do these, a mediocre wash consistently. And yet, by the end of all those months of working on it, it didn't do anything that it didn't do in the first place. In fact, it worked worse. The second obsession, as I said, was with these cameras. These cameras to him appeared to be intelligence gathering devices, so he could use it against people or threaten people. He had a lot of contempt for other people generally, so it was very passive aggressive. Like you'll see here, he had much contempt for truck drivers, of all things, and he owns a truck wash. He had a lot of contempt for pretty much everybody, so he assumed everyone's engaged in skullduggery, so he could use that threat, well, I can always look at the cameras, to which I would say, go ahead, whatever, I don't care, I have nothing to hide. Jethro kind of did, but I don't, But, I mean, the point is, that was his other obsession, so none of his obsessions had anything to do with the smooth and profitable operation of this business, let alone anybody associated with this business coming out of there a winner. It was all about him and his dream, or whatever that was. So I'm going to skip through these things so I don't get too bogged down. Again, just to give you a hint of what his personality and his character were like generally, I listed out some different types of people, and I think when you put them all together, you'll have some vague idea of what Mr. H was like. Self-serving snake oil salesmen / con artists, self-serving politicians, self-serving apostate preachers, televangelists. These money preachers on TV, like Kenneth Copeland building an airport in his front yard, or maybe it was his backyard, an airport, while people are starving. Self-serving celebrity scientists. There's these celebrity scientists. Again, I've studied junk science for 30 years. I've fought against it. These guys are corrupting science for their own agendas, their own social and political agendas. Self-serving corporate CEOs, these people who come into a company and they prop it up on paper long enough so that they can get out with a golden parachute or a step up to a better job, and if everything in that company pays the price, so be it. They don't care. And if you've ever probably seen like boyfriends and girlfriends or spouses, and you have an abusive spouse or an abusive partner, they're serving themselves. They don't care about the other person, right? They use the other person. They abuse the other person. You put all these types of people together and you've got an overall picture of what Mr. H was like. Now, he did it more passive aggressively. He did it with that fake smile, that creepy smile, which made it tough because it took me a while to figure out what this guy was really about. And even then I didn't want to believe it, so it took me a while longer to accept that what I was perceiving was in fact correct. And by that time, that's when I really started getting nervous and just downright scared of this guy. Again, this is the type of person who can, in the right circumstances, really hurt another person. They can destroy another person. And in fact, for what it's worth, that's exactly what he did with me. Now, there's one other person I'm going to point out. That if I was to pick one individual that most people have heard of that Mr. H resembled the most, I would say it is Alex Jones. Now, this is more in terms of his behavior. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories and, New World Order's going to eat your baby, that kind of thing. That's Alex Jones, right? If you don't know Alex Jones, go to Infowars.com. I'm not going to say he's a cult leader, but he's built a cult of personality around this thing of fighting the New World Order. But his personality is what I'm getting at, is very similar to Mr. H. Now, I'll go over this and show you, and I'm going to go over Alex Jones again later and show you just how similar they are, because to me it's important that you understand, that you can kind of visualize what Mr. H was like. So, this is Mr. H, not Alex Jones. Well, actually both, but I'm describing Mr. H at this point. He was incredibly arrogant. He was the man. He knew everything. He was really full of himself. heightened opinion of himself. He was a dominating person, even though he might do it in passive-aggressive ways. He had a fake humility that really became disturbing later. Because I really value humility and I strive for it myself. I'm not always good at it. I have my own points where I get kind of cocky and arrogant, but I strive for it. I think it's a wonderful character trait, and he didn't have it. It was just fake. He was a megalomaniac, ultimately. And everything, he kind of saw the whole world as in the service of him. And it's not to say he couldn't interact with them or work with them to some degree, but ultimately, and a good example of this is how I told you he wasn't at the truck wash that often. He was working with these other ventures, but when he would show up at these unannounced, bizarre hours or hours that had nothing to do with when he actually told us he was going to be there. Well, first, when he wasn't there, he didn't seem to care really about what went on at the truck wash. I mean, literally. You could have customers who are so angry, we thought they were going to come in with a shotgun, because the truck was washed so poorly or something like that. He didn't care. Anything that was going on that a normal business person their ears would perk up. And, huh? Really? Yeah, I got to deal with that. He didn't care. If I told him on the phone about something, whatever. But the minute he actually walked into the building, all of a sudden everything going on in there was, on alert. It was, DEFCON 1 or something. I think DEFCON 1 is the most alert. I think it goes backwards from 5 to 1. But as soon as in other words, when he's actually there, all of a sudden everything matters. For example, we had trucks lined up in the morning often. Sometimes they slept there all night. Sometimes they would get there at 7 because they thought we opened at 7 because Jethro kept opening at whatever hour he felt like it. Sometimes they knew we opened at 9, but they wanted to be the first in line so that they could get on their way quickly. The point is, there were often, most of the time, trucks waiting when we opened at 9. Now, if Mr. H wasn't there, we could tell him that on the phone or whatever, and whatever. He just in one ear, out the other, it didn't matter. If he actually showed up and he saw a truck there, it didn't matter if it was 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m. He would freak out. Oh my gosh, there's trucks. We got to open now. We got to open early. We got to, you see what I mean? So, in other words, if it's in his consciousness, it matters. If it isn't, then it doesn't matter. Again, it's this ego thing. It's all about him. The whole universe exists for his purposes. And that's why you could have so much nonsense going on at the truck wash when he wasn't there. Like Jethro turning away $30,000 in business annually, by my estimate. And Mr. H wasn't even concerned about that. But if he did it when Mr. H was there, well, he still didn't really, I never really saw him jump down Jethro's throat for anything. But Jethro wouldn't do that if Mr. H is there, I guess is what I'm getting at. So, from that alone, you can kind of tell what we're dealing with. We're dealing with someone who, as he moves around this world of ours, wherever he is the only place that matters. So if he's out at his truck or his car washes, that's what matters. And whatever's going on there is the urgent thing in the world, even if the truck wash is burning down at the time. As soon as he gets to the truck wash, all of a sudden that place, everything that's going on there, he just taking every little thing apart, nitpicking about this, that, and the other thing. And as soon as he leaves, he doesn't care anymore. And that's why he could issue instructions to us to do this, that, and the other thing, and be really urgent about it while he's there. And he leaves, and if we couldn't get to it, or if it was, frankly, just something really dumb or counterproductive, we wouldn't do it. Because we knew what was going to happen. He would forget all about it. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying. The whole universe revolves around him and his immediate vicinity. And because he didn't care about the truck wash being a profitable business, as you're going to find out, even when he was away from the truck wash, it didn't matter what happened at the truck wash. So he had a slick salesman type of speaking. Very fast, dominating, trying to take control of the conversation. Well, no conversation really, no dialogue. He's one of those people who's always, thinking of what he's going to say next instead of listening to you. For example, there were times I would start telling stories or saying something, and I could get several seconds into it, well into it, past the introduction, you might say. And he would just interrupt as if I wasn't even speaking and start telling me something totally different. He wasn't listening to a word I said. And if you brought that up to him, he didn't get it. He couldn't even conceive of that he was doing that. So again, he wasn't super in touch with reality. I guess I don't know any nicer way to put it. His mind just raced at 2,000 miles an hour. He's just one thing to another, just blah, 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 blah. His motions were the same way. So he would come, everyone's nice and calm. Like I say, on Saturday, I tried to create a barbershop atmosphere with the drivers since I was running it myself. And it would just all be good and casual. It was a lot like a barbershop. I really love those old barbershop atmospheres. And as soon as Mr. H got in there, just everything's racing around. And, if you've ever been in a room, maybe you're working with people on a project or in a church Bible study or something. It's something where everyone's nice and calm. And then someone who was out in the parking lot, snorting some coke and smoking some meth, and they come storming into the room and they're just all over everything, and everyone in the room's just like, and they feel their own heart start beating fast, and they're just starting to shake just from watching this other person's behavior, because the other person's living in a reality that's moving like 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times faster than the reality that the people in the room are experiencing. And that's what Mr. H was like. And he had that impact on other people around him. It really agitated people. A lot of people would say, well, not a lot, but I mean, if we talked about it at all, we were experiencing the same thing. You would feel your heart beating faster. There was something wrong with the way he did things, and it affected the people around him in a negative way. For this reason, in large part, he had no focus whatsoever. He engaged in no planning. He didn't plan things out step by step. I never saw him walk in with a checklist. I use checklists all the time, start knocking them off. He just had these things in his head, but in his head's moving 2,000 miles an hour from one thing to another. And a good way of seeing how that worked manifested out in the world was he could ask 2 or 3 or 4 questions in one sentence. If you wrote it out, there wouldn't be periods there. And he might not even wait for an answer, or he might expect you to answer all 4. Most likely, he forgot himself what some of the questions were he just asked. I can't do it. I tried to simulate this. I can't make that up off the top of my head, so I wrote these down. It's the only way I can do 4 questions in a row, but he did this all the time. So just imagine someone comes in, your barbershop atmosphere, and boom, 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 and this guy comes in all hyper, and he's like, did you find the bucket opener? How many trucks did you wash this morning? Did you move those shelves I asked you about? Hey, do you think we should be open on Labor Day weekend? And then either stopping to try to get an answer from you or just taking off because he saw something shiny. How do you answer those questions? That's 4 questions on totally different subjects. And I don't even know if he wants an answer, because he might just turn around and walk away after he asked it. This is what you're dealing with Mr. H. There's no way to function properly with this person. And in terms of running a business, I hope you understand how you're not going to get things done by any reasonable definition of management, how to manage things. Of course, along with that, he was a motor mouth. He would just talk, and he wouldn't stop talking. And it ticked off everyone. There were customers who wouldn't even come in when he was there. They would come in, see him, and they would leave. He would just talk people's heads off, usually about things they just didn't care about. It's not to say he couldn't engage some drivers on a certain topic at times, to where they were happy to have that conversation and go on their way. It did happen on occasion, but some of these drivers themselves are kind of strange. Most of them are really cool. I love the drivers generally. I even love the weird ones. They were colorful characters, but for that reason, a lot of the way he talked turned into monologues or diatribes. And you weren't going to get a word in. Even if you did, who cares? It was obvious he was thinking of what he's going to say next. Again, he knew it all. He knew everything. Amazing. Just amazing how he knew absolutely everything. Even though he was wrong about just about everything, but still. Intellectual jack of all trades, master of none. That's what I would call it. Now the thing is, with this kind of walking Trivial Pursuit board of his, from what I could tell, the reason he learned a little bit about a lot of things was so that he could, in fact, inject himself into any conversation. And once he had a foothold in there, the shoehorn, he could just take it over, and no one else was really going to talk again. And this is a big, big problem, especially when people had something to say, such as something relevant to running of the business. Now, here's this kind of a this is a specific example of the strangeness of this. And again, we're in a business environment, so these strange things have an impact on the way the business runs and the way that people relate to each other, employees, customers, contractors. I don't know how I did this, but several years ago I kind of trained myself deliberately to recognize, kind of in real time, if someone asked me a question, a yes or no question, but the way they asked it was ambiguous or they used poor grammar, so that, in other words, if I answered yes or no, it wouldn't necessarily be clear what I was answering, or if the question concerned accuracy and correctness. In those cases, instead of saying yes or no, I would say that's correct, because then there's no ambiguity. Now, most people, including myself, when you're dealing with affirmatives in a conversation, you normally say things like, yeah, sure, you bet, uh-huh, mm-hmm, things like that. And that's just perfectly normal way to communicate. But Mr. H, I would say about, and no exaggeration, about 90% of the time when he gave an affirmative answer of that type, he would in fact use the word correct. And he would say it very mechanically like that, correct. And he wouldn't just do it in affirmatives, he would also do it in agreement. So if you just said something he agreed with, like, I might come inside in the morning and say, wow, the sun's out, it's going to be a hot day today, correct. And he would say it that quickly and that mechanically. So I barely got the sentence out of my mouth, and he will say, correct. And I'm sorry, I don't know how to put it, but that's a strange way to interact with other people. But that's typical of the way he interacted with other people. And I just gave that example because I think it's kind of striking. And when you witness that, it's really strange to be around. The big problem with social interaction here. From what I could tell, everyone at some point called Mr. H an a-hole or something of that vein. Employees, all the employees did. The drivers who were regulars did. Excuse me. And contractors, some of them got just furious with him. They called him that. By Mr. H's own admission, one of the redneck mafia had called him an a-hole. And Mr. H also, on I think 2 occasions, told me, he's telling me about his life, and he said, yeah, all my life people have, called me an a-hole, and, that's their problem. I don't let that bother me. I don't let that get me down. And, do I have to say it, really? do I have to say it? The fact is, if everyone, by your own admission, everyone throughout your life has been calling you an a-hole, you might want to look into the possibility that maybe you are in fact an a-hole. I know it's not easy to look in a mirror that clearly, but Mr. H would not even try. So it kind of gives you an idea of how he responded to criticism or constructive criticism. He responded to that with a passive aggressiveness that might hurt you then or later. It could range from an insult to kind of a passive aggressive fury. He did not take criticism well. I mean, frankly, I think you're safer going out and insulting the Prophet Muhammad in Tehran than you are giving constructive criticism to Mr. H with nothing but the best of intentions as tactfully as you possibly can. I think you have a better chance of not getting hurt if you just go insult Muhammad in Tehran. He may not hurt you right at the time, but you can just see all the chips on his shoulder, and he was very clever about the way he would do that. So let me talk a bit about the way his insulting and belittling affected other people. He would do things like, Jethro and I once, one of these days when the guy who was with us in the summer left, and then Mr. H had not even started to hire another person, we went through a 2-week period where we worked pretty much every single day, all day, without any breaks or lunch. We were just absolutely exhausted, overworked. Mr. H came in on one of those days late, like 3:30, and he went over to Jethro and asked him, did you move those soap barrels or whatever? It was something that he had told us to do. And Jethro said, no. And Mr. H just immediately said, what do you do with your downtime? And he would do that. He would get in your face when he does these kinds of things. And, on the assumption that we just had all this free time to spare. Well, we didn't have any free time. We weren't even getting breaks or lunches, which I think is illegal. But in any event, we were really tired. We were working hard because he didn't schedule and hire properly. And yet, he would turn it around as if it's our fault. That one time that happened, ever since then, Jethro's been looking for another job. He may already have one for all I know. And Mr. H pulled that stunt all the time. The example when I told him after the painting was all done, how on the very first day the paint was sucking up dirt and grease and grime, and I called him up and told him, there's a problem with this paint. And he wasn't there. He was on the phone. He didn't ask probing questions. He immediately said, you're not washing the wall correctly. And when I told him the floor was slippery because there's no sand in the paint, he said, well, you must have slippery shoes. So he would do things like this all the time. Very insulting, belittling. He wouldn't listen to what you were saying. These are verifiable facts. All you have to do is go and look at the wall, look at the floor. About a week later, one of the redneck mafia came in and he almost wiped out on the floor. And he looks down there and says there's no sand in the paint. And yet it was 2 months later before Mr. H finally acknowledged that. And then it became this madhouse circus where they had to repaint all over again. I had told him the day after, I think it was the day after we reopened for painting. So, when you're dealing with this all the time, the business isn't going to run smoothly. If he's the central, even though he may not be absolutely in charge, because the redneck mafia, again, I believe if they weren't silent partners, somehow, some way, he was under their control. They were able to take over his business with his painting for 5 weeks and shut down his revenue for 5 weeks. But he was still the center person. He was the owner. He was publicly the owner. He was in charge. And when you have somebody like that who's affecting everyone, the employees, the contractors, the customers, even Chamber of Commerce, if they were to come in or something, when that is your representative of the business, I think you can kind of see where it goes. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, I believe that Mr. H had contempt for truck drivers. And frankly, as far as I could tell, pretty much nothing but contempt for truck drivers. It's not to say he wouldn't find one that he liked now and then, but as a class of people, this man who chose to open a truck wash had contempt for truck drivers. And you would see this in things like, I told him over and over and over what the truck drivers were telling me. They don't know we're here. We have no signs. You won't let me mark it. And he would not let me mark it. He wouldn't mark it until he got that machine running, which will probably never happen. I'd say the drivers don't know we're here. And he'd say, oh, they know we're here. They're a bunch of liars. These guys are always pulling stunts like that. It's like, really? But the thing was, a driver could look Mr. H in the eye, talk to him, and say, boy, I didn't even know you were here. On my way down the highway, I was on the CB and asking all the drivers out there if they knew of a truck wash in the area, and nobody even knew you were here. And even then, Mr. H would look that guy in the eye and say, oh, they know we're here. They know we're here. It's like, really? So every one of these drivers was lying to him over the CB. Really? Why? I'm not sure what they were getting out of that. That's the kind of contempt he had for truck drivers. And here's a good example. I was washing a truck, and I had to start with the engine. So I open up the hood, I start working on the engine, and the block, like, or I don't know if it was the block, but it was a big part of the steel part of the engine, flat, it was rusted. I think I have a picture of it. And it punctured from the power washer and started spraying out a long, hot stream of antifreeze. And it hit me in the leg, and it burned my leg, and I, like, ow, and I spun around, jumping from the shock of getting heated, and then it hit my other leg because I'd spun around, and then I think I fell down to the ground for a second. It didn't disable me, but it hurt, and I was really worried it burned me more than it did. And of course I had this hot antifreeze all over, so I went and washed it off. But I mean, this stuff, when it first came out, it was shooting out like 3 or 4 feet. It was almost hitting the wall, and then slowly it was, going less. Well, I went and told Mr. H about this, and the driver had gone to eat somewhere, so he wasn't even there. And I told Mr. H because he was on the property at the time, and the first thing out of Mr. H's mouth was, "That's what drivers do. You know what? They wait until their truck's falling apart, and then they bring it into a place like this, and they make sure that we somehow, add the final breakage to it, and then they expect us to pay for the repairs and all that." That's the first thing out of his mouth. He couldn't even conceive of the idea that maybe this truck, that's the state of repair this truck was in. The driver had no idea this was going to happen, and it happened there. I mean, the first thing out of his mouth is the driver did this deliberately. And then I found the driver. I had to go to the restaurants in the area. I found the driver, and he was like, "Wow, really?" He was really shocked. And he comes back over, and he looks at it, and he's like, "Wow, this is no good." And he asked us where repair places were, and then he just drove out without any antifreeze. He didn't ask us for anything. He didn't ask us to pay for a repair or accuse us of damaging his truck or anything. But that's what Mr. H first thought of, right? Now, when you have contempt for your customer base, I hope you can see where problems are going to arise. That is how not to do business. Mr. H was a walking contradiction, and I'm going to give you some examples. As I give you these examples, again, try to imagine working in an environment where this is the person who describes himself as the owner, the boss, the one who calls the shots, the final arbiter, everything but where the buck stops. Okay? Early on when I started working there, he had told me, well, when I bought this place, I promised myself I was not going to run the truck wash. In other words, he wasn't going to take over operations of it. He had his own goals, which you'll see in a moment. He wasn't going to come in there and like be the employee running the place. That's what he said he promised himself. And yet, throughout my time there, when he came in, that's all he did. He ran the truck wash. He got behind the point of sale computer. He would go out and price trucks. He would ring them up, and he did it wrong all the time. We lost revenue every time he was there. And I know that because I'm an old revenue manager. I was tracking revenues. We did worse when he was there. He didn't know how to do it right. He was running the truck wash, and yet he told me he promised himself he would not run the truck wash. Now, he didn't get any of this other stuff done, like payroll, sending out invoices to customers, even getting his precious machine running. He would neglect all that stuff to run the truck wash all the time. And when he did it, he did nothing but interfere, in particular with me, since I know how to run a place like that. Like I said, I was building this customer base of people who were really comfortable with me and, Jethro to some degree, and this barbershop atmosphere. I was trying to create a really nice place, and he just, again, threw a hand grenade in it every time because he was running the truck wash. When I first started there, he had pointed out, there's a flat screen TV in the lobby, and he said, if you have downtime, if there's no trucks to wash, you're free to sit down and watch TV. I don't care. And I was like, okay. Now, I don't watch TV. I haven't owned a television since 1996. I can't stomach watching television, but I took that as meaning I could read a book or do something else, maybe personal, or maybe work on one of these initiatives that is for work. But I took it as meaning I had my little guitar there, so I could pull out my guitar. I took it to mean I could do that. Fine. Now, as it turns out, on average, we had these busy days, but on average over time, about 50% of the time or more, we had no trucks, nothing, absolutely nothing. There were days we would go maybe 3 or 4 hours without seeing a single truck pull in. I did Saturdays, 6 hours, no trucks. That's a lot of downtime. So what did he do in the real world after he told me, well, I don't mind, just sit down and watch TV if you like, that's fine. Instead, he was one of those guys who said, well, why aren't you cleaning? You find something to do. What are you doing just sitting around? Why don't you look busy? And those kinds of people. Look busy is silly. Being busy is great. But the idea of telling an employee to look busy for the sake of looking busy is, in my humble opinion, very bad management. If they're at the point where they have absolutely nothing to do, why doesn't the manager take responsibility for that instead of blaming this person because they're doing nothing? Especially if, as in this case, the guy specifically tells me, you're free to do nothing, you're free to watch TV, which has got to be the most mind-vegetating activity imaginable. And he came right out and told me to do it, even when I told him I don't watch television. So, again, a walking contradiction. Now here's a huge one. How do I even describe this one? When we had the 5-week shutdown for painting and everyone got their pay cut in half, roughly, or less, because he had just hired a third person and then he cut all our hours because the wash bay wasn't open for 5 weeks. So we all got just brutalized by these tiny little paychecks, and we didn't know when it was going to end. When we collectively, because everyone was hurt by it, there were 3 of us working there at the time, Jethro, myself, and this guy in the summer. When we told him this is really, really hurting us, instead of owning up to it and admitting that he'd blown it again and things like that, what did he do? He pulled out the violins and started singing, Woe is Mr. H. Started singing that song. He said, well, you think you got it bad? I haven't even turned a profit here yet. That's pretty startling. The truth was, over those 5 weeks, his revenues were cut in half. I was tracking revenues, so I know that even better than he did. How not to do business. So it's like, yeah, okay, well, that seems reasonable. He feels our pain. He hasn't even turned a profit yet since he took over, and this was 7 months into his ownership. But here's the thing. Shortly after we got running again after this, we got talking, and I was talking more about real business with him. And he told me that his intention from the time he took over this place, and his wife knew about it, and she was in agreement with this plan. So he was very specific and deliberate when he told me this. He said, I had planned to not make a profit the first year. In other words, he had planned to neglect all these things that would make the place profitable because he wanted to get that machine running, and he thought it was going to take about a year to do it. And his wife was okay with that. So he wasn't making this up. Here he was telling me the truth. He planned, he didn't just say, I don't care if I don't make a profit. He said, I deliberately planned to not make a profit the first year. Okay, now we'll look at what a bad business decision that was later. But the point is, when we had a very legitimate complaint that our pay was cut in half and we were suffering horribly because of it, what did he do? He completely negated what this plan of his was, and instead he told us, well, you think you got it bad? I haven't even turned a profit yet. He just said what he needed to say to get sympathy and to get us off of his back because of what he had done to us that really hurt us. I'm still living in a car because of that. Jethro was so bad off, he tried to borrow $300 from the homeless person. The guy who was there in the summer, he was moving to another state at the end of September to take on a management job. He had to borrow money to get there. I mean, this really hurt us. And yet Mr. H would say something like, you think you got it bad? I haven't even turned a profit. And then when he forgot he had told me that, he comes out and tells me the truth. I deliberately planned to not make a profit the first year. I mean, to me, that's a liar. I don't know, some people might call it something else. I think that's just a blatant liar, but it's two-faced. You can't do business that way. Another example, I work Saturdays by myself, and for some reason he kept coming in though, and he would screw up everything. If he just let me run it myself, it was great. I mean, sometimes we had great business, sometimes we had no trucks. That was out of my hands because he wouldn't let me mark it, but I could run the place just fine, and when he showed up, there were just threw chaos into everything. Everything went to hell. But let's say he shows up 2 hours into it on Saturday and there were no trucks there. So I've been there for 2 hours and I haven't had a single truck come in. So he comes in, and remember how reality only exists where Mr. H exists in his mind. So this truck wash had no trucks for 2 hours. I'm perfectly content with it. It's the nature of the business under the circumstances that he wouldn't let me market, he wouldn't let me go out and drum up business, okay? I wasn't worried about it. It didn't relate to anything in the big picture because I was there all the time. I knew what was probably coming. So Mr. H shows up 2 hours into it, finds out there's no trucks, and what does he say? I think we should close on Saturdays. I think we shouldn't even be open on Saturdays. Alright, jump ahead 4 more hours, because those 4 hours after we had 2 hours of nothing, we had a lot of business. At the end of those 4 hours, 4 hours after he had said, I think we should close on Saturdays, we don't have enough business, he says, should I schedule a second person for Saturdays? He's a walking contradiction, and he cannot analyze data and information properly. He can't focus on anything. I knew exactly what was going on in terms of forecasting and scheduling, what the deal was. You had periods where there were no trucks. It's just the way it was. If you'd let me mark it, we could have fixed that, but, you know. Anyway, there's so many of these, I don't know what to say. How about this one? We had a soap, I'll call it BK, and this soap really didn't work. It just burned trucks. In other words, the metal, when you put the soap on the metal, it would put these horrible brown streaks in it, and they were permanent. So you had to like pay someone to go polish it out, or maybe wait a year and 12 washes later it might come out on its own. But it stained the metal. And this is beautiful, shiny chrome, you know, the pride and joy of the truck. Well, Mr. H fancied himself the expert on soaps because, you know, he ran these car washes. Now, cars are different than trucks, for one thing, but so because he didn't manage supplies and he would wait until we ran out and told him we're out of it, then he would order it, and we'd go several days without it. He would do things like say, well, if we ran out of our main soap, he'd say, well, go ahead and use BK. It's basically the same thing. All right? So we use BK, and what happens? Every truck for the rest of the day gets its metal burned. Very unhappy customers. And frankly, very unhappy employees, because we know that's going to happen. Well, what's Mr. H do with that? He comes up with, you know, it's not our fault. He would blame me and Jethro, for example. He would say, well, you left it on too long. That's the problem. It's like, well, no, BK burns trucks. That's what it does. It doesn't matter how long you leave it on there. You're the one who told us to use BK. Well, no, the clear coat was bad on that truck. You know, the driver hadn't washed it in 6 months. You know, I know he said it had been a month, but obviously he hadn't washed it in 6 months. That's why it burned it. Anything but him telling us to do something that was monumentally dumb. To use a product that does nothing but burn their trucks. Another one, he would say on a couple occasions, I think 2 occasions I recall, where he would just say, more or less in passing, something along the lines of, safety is my biggest concern. And then, of course, he'd see something shiny and go on to some other topic. So they came out of his mouth twice that I recall. He never harped on it. It was never a focus or an emphasis of his at all. So he says, safety is my biggest concern a couple of times, and yet this is by far the most dangerous workplace I've ever seen, let alone worked in. We'll discuss that more under environmental health and safety. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of these. Okay, so he didn't do our payroll, as I said before. He wouldn't get our payroll done on time about half the time. He never admitted that he just blew it, or that he got distracted, or he wasn't a responsible business owner. He would never admit that, ever. It was always, one time Jethro and I were just astonished by this. He came in early, fairly early in the morning when we opened, and he stood behind the desk running the truck wash, which he said he was never going to do. And he's just talking, just blah, 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 blah. But he's talking drivers' heads off the whole time. He's running the register, and he'd pull out things. He'd pull up like software on the computer. He might pull up, say, the payroll software, but it would never actually be used. It would just be pulled up there, and then it would be put in the background while we, got the receipts for customers. 8 hours later, he hadn't done payroll yet. And what's he say? I don't have enough time in the day. I'm so busy. My phone's ringing all the time. I don't have enough time to get anything done. And we get paid late because of that. Another time he got payroll done late, and he blamed it on the government. He said that the government set new rules, whatever that means, on payroll at 6 p.m. So the implication is that he had to go figure out what these new rules were before he could do payroll. First of all, that's nonsense. You must know that's nonsense. The government doesn't just throw something out there and in an instant you can't do payroll until you get... that's BS, right? It is. Second of all, he was doing that remotely on that day. So from home, he was remotely coming into our point of sale computer, and I was doing the Z at the time, the end of day. So I watched him. He didn't even come into the thing until after the deadline for doing payroll. So he didn't even try, and he can't do it from home. So he just blatantly lied again. And he did this all the time. One time he said that, and he said it's because Memorial Day, because of the holiday. He said everyone is paid late because of Memorial Day. Well, first of all, it was Labor Day, actually, not Memorial Day. Second of all, he's saying that everyone in the United States of America was being paid late that week because of the holiday. You tell me whether that's true. I'll let you answer that one. Alright, now just a few random thoughts about Mr. H. I mentioned before he had no business plan, or at least no sign of a business plan. However, he did have this idea. And I'll cut to the chase. It took me months to figure this out. I had to learn who the Redneck Mafia were. I had to learn that they owned the building. Again, no orientation, so these are things I had to ferret out on my own. And eventually I figured out what was going on, and he confirmed it as I spoke to him. Mr. H, the reason he planned to not make a profit the first year is because he saw an operating, functioning business as his own personal research and development site. In other words, the only thing he cared about, hence the obsession, was getting that machine to where it would do mediocre washes consistently, and then he could franchise it out or make a bunch of them or whatever. That was his goal. Now, if you have a research and development site, go for it. Go develop your dream. The problem is that he was doing it with a functioning, operating business. Well, guess who that affects? It affects his employees, it affects his customers, it affects contractors, it affects everybody who's associated with that place. That's how self-centered, self-absorbed this guy was. This whole thing was about him. He treated it as an R&D place. That's why he didn't even plan to make a profit his first year. What does that mean? It means he had no intention of doing anything right, getting proper maintenance, marketing, sending out invoices to customers. He didn't even plan to do any of this because he didn't care. But it's people like me who have to suffer for that, and Jethro, and the contractors, and the customers. The customers were depending on us to provide them with professional services so that they could maintain their professional, truck drivers are professionals. They had to have clean trucks for the most part. Sometimes it was optional. Most of the time they had to have it for some purpose. We'll see that in a future video. Mr. H would call me or Jethro a manager just on a whim. we're talking to a customer and he didn't want to deal with it, he would say, well, talk to Paul. He's a good guy. He's the manager. He'll take care of you. And I'd be like, huh? Manager? It's like, hey, nobody's there as a manager. I'm not paid as a manager, that's for sure, and I have no managerial duties. Even when I try to offer you my services as a competent business person, you don't want me to. In terms of marketing or revenue management or something, you don't even want me to do it. But he would just call me a manager that way. But the thing is, in the customer's eyes, that creates the impression that I have more skills and experience and knowledge and responsibility than I really have. And that's a terrible position to put me in. And he would do the same thing with Jethro. You know, yeah, Jethro will help you out with that. He's the manager. He's a good guy. He'll help you out. You don't just throw the word manager out like that. This is how not to do business. He got very personal. And I'm not talking about like political correctness. When I was younger, you had personal talk in businesses all the time. It wasn't a big deal because you didn't have people could handle reality a lot better back then. But there's a difference between talking about personal things or talking about the taboo subjects, you know, politics and religion, and I mean getting personal, like probing, asking me blatantly personal questions that I just don't want to answer, frankly, to anybody, let alone to my boss. But the thing was, because he had me over a barrel, because I was there all the time, I was sleeping there as well as working there, he would get upset with me if I didn't answer these questions. Now you can probably tell from the personality type, the reason he's asking these questions is because to him, he's gathering intel. This is something he can use later to manipulate me or to use against me or something, and that's why he does it. Also, he had a savior complex and this father figure complex. I'm the same age as him. You know, I already have a savior, and I had a great father. I don't need Mr. H for that. He was my boss, and that's where it should have stayed. He had no business getting as personal as he did, and I mean very personal. I don't even want to tell you about it. That's how personal it is. You talk about feeling uncomfortable at work, and I couldn't get away because I slept there at his urging. You can kind of see what I'm saying when I say he drew me into this situation where I couldn't win. It was like indentured servitude. Here's a couple examples of just how poor his business acumen really was. When he finally got the logo for the business, which was several months into being there, he went on the cheap and he didn't buy the rights to his own logo. So the graphic artist who made his logo owned the rights to it. Now think about what I said a moment ago. He saw this place as a research and development site so that he could get the machine to make a consistently mediocre wash and then franchise it out or build a bunch of these, copy it for himself. Presumably each of those is going to have the logo on it, right? You would think that's kind of what a franchise is. That's a lot of a franchise, is the familiar name and logo and such. And he didn't own the rights to his own logo. That gives you some idea of... Now, he went to business school. Mr. H went to business school. Well, in Minnesota, but he went to business school. I didn't. How come I could see that something was wrong with that and he didn't? I'm going to give you a couple of gems that Mr. H gave me, and you have no idea how much I have to button and staple my lips so I don't talk about them now, but I'm going to try to save them for later because you'll know why when I read them. This is the kind of stuff I had to deal with from the man who seemed to believe that he was the greatest businessman on the face of the earth. He said, you know, my management style is management by consensus. I want to talk about this so badly. Here's another gem. Oh no, I don't believe I'm going to say this out loud. Please do not take this out of context and put it in another video as if I said this. Please. Mr. H said, most small businesses fail because of too much business. Not too rapid of growth, too much business. In other words, too many customers were giving too much money. That's not going to talk about it. We'll talk about it later. I just want to remind you of what was said in the last video about contractors. When these contractors, these Three Stooges, Marx Brothers, Faulty Towers group of painters came in and messed everything up for 5 weeks. They were supposed to be done in 2 weeks, and I asked him, doesn't the contract specify they have to pay penalties if they go over the deadline? And he, I already talked about it. I don't want to talk about it again, but he said, no, it's a contractor's market. We could never get them to accept those terms. Not going to talk about it. Not yet. We'll talk about it later. Another one, he came out. Now, I saw him wash maybe 3 trucks in all the time we were there, even though he thought he was the greatest truck washer in the world. As far as I know, on those 3 trucks, he got complaints, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, he did not work on trucks. He would work the register, he would work the customers, or drive the customers away, but drive them crazy. But he didn't like washing trucks, getting wet, getting dirty like we did. One time he came out, I was washing a truck by myself, which I'm fine with, because that way both sides are going to be clean. I like that, to be honest, as opposed to having Jethro over there. For whatever reason, Mr. H came out and he picked up the power washer wand on the other side of the truck, and over the, we could see each other across the part, the back of the truck that connects to the trailer. And he raises up the wand in the air and he yells, with this big old smile of his, "Teamwork!" And then he proceeds to start doing a crappy job. And it reminds me of like World War II, those posters with Rosie the Riveter, and she has like, American flag bandana tied in her hair, and they're just like, "We can do it!" That's the way he was. Now, if you don't understand how that was not teamwork, you'll find out when we get to the episode on teamwork. So there's just a couple examples of how he thought businesses should run. I'm not going to talk about it. We'll get to it in future episodes. When he got the business cards made, he wanted to put our names on them, as in some cards with his name, some cards with Jethro's name, some cards with my name. Jethro and I washed trucks. Now, he might have called us managers when he felt like it, but we were truck washers. That's what we did. And he wanted to put our names on the cards. He also wanted to put the hours and the prices. And just in case, even if you don't understand what's wrong with that, we'll talk about that later too, but he had never analyzed the prices. The pricing structure was incomprehensible. He inherited it from the previous failed truck wash owner and never changed anything. He quoted prices off the top of his head, which is one reason we didn't have very good revenue when he was there. Hopefully you see the problem with that, putting the names of grunt workers, $9 an hour grunt workers, and prices and hours on the business cards, which have a logo that he didn't even own. Enough said. Bill collectors were constantly calling, well, not constantly, but they frequently called, trying to collect on debts incurred by the previous owner. Mr. H kept doing business as the same truck wash name, and during the transition he didn't deal with that properly, so it created a real problem for us. Mr. H would not listen to qualified people, and more importantly, and this is where in business this is a common problem, very common. I've seen this in executives all the time. It's a big problem. He could not discern who was qualified and who was not. Some people put a lot of they look at credentials and they just get starstruck. And NPR is notorious for doing that. NPR at the end of every episode, or I'm sorry, at the end of every interview or something, well, so-and-so is Professor Emeritus at such and such university. And wow, that sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? Of course, that person may have just ridden through the political cult that is academia without actually knowing what they're doing, but that's neither here nor there. You're not going to hear on NPR them saying, well, Paul B. is a homeless truck washer living in his car. You're not going to hear that, right? Because that's not considered credible. Well, Mr. H would give credibility to people like Jethro, who didn't like to work, turned away 30 grand a year in business, and was trained by working 6 years at failed truck washes. I have all this business experience, and part of what I did was specifically revenue management, making companies money. And yet he wouldn't listen to what I would say. Again, there was like a jealousy aspect there. But I've seen this in other businesses with even, again, all the way up to presidents, where they just don't comprehend that, you know, we'll talk about this in another episode. I don't want to get bogged down in it. But here's a quick example of this. On holidays, Jethro, of course, didn't like to work, so he would always say, well, we shouldn't be open on the holiday, or the whole holiday weekend. Trucks never show up. And I would sit there and go, what? For example, Labor Day. Labor Day, the holiday, is on Monday. Jethro wanted to shut down Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, based on his experience. The thing was, he has no experience. If they were shutting down on previous Labor Days, then by definition he was at home or out hunting or partying. He wasn't at the truck wash to see how many trucks were being turned away, right? Based on my revenue management experience, I'm thinking a different way. I'm thinking, well, Labor Day itself, Monday, is a shopping holiday. These trucks are delivering the very stuff that people are going to buy on this shopping holiday. There's nothing about Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that would stop these drivers. The businesses aren't closed. The distribution centers aren't closed. There's some offices that take 4-day weekends. I said, that's craziness. We should be open on Labor Day weekend. Maybe Labor Day we can shut down or just have one person. But he didn't listen to me. He listened to Jethro. Now, of course, I slept at the truck wash, so I was there all 4 days, and guess what? Nothing but one. It would have been the busiest weekend we'd ever had. Just truck drivers coming up one after another, trying the door, looking at the sign saying we're closed, and thinking, what? This makes no sense. There's an example of how Mr. H could not discern who was qualified, who was a good advisor, and who wasn't. Wow, I'm going to get so bogged down on time here. I think I'm going to have to skip through a lot of stuff. I think what I've said already has given you a really good idea of what we're dealing with there in terms of why the business failed or was failing, and why my ability to use this as any kind of a stepping stone to get out of homelessness was doomed to failure as well. Because Mr. H threw a monkey wrench into absolutely everything. So let me just throw in a few other things to flesh this out. I want to make sure the point is clearly made that Mr. H was totally unreliable. If he said he was going to be there at a certain time, the only thing you knew for sure is that that was not the time he was going to show up. And that's not an exaggeration. I take that very seriously. When I say I'm going to do something, I do it. If I say I'm going to be there at a certain time, I will bend everything I possibly have to make sure that it happens, or that I communicate to the person that I'm not going to be there at that time. But I don't just stiff people like that. I mean, I once had I went out to lunch. I said I'll be back in a half hour, but I couldn't because my engine overheated. One of the belts stripped out in there. I don't have a phone. And frankly, it wouldn't have mattered. If I'd showed up 3 hours later and said, oh, my car broke down, Jethro probably wouldn't have cared. But you know what? I went walking around. I found someone with a phone, and I said, I've really got to call work. And I called him, and it was probably still within the half hour. And I told Jethro, I got a problem with my car. I'm going to be a few hours, maybe. It turned out it was only like a half hour. But I go through that effort to do that. Mr. H almost daily would tell me, I'm going to be there at 6 in the morning, or 7 in the morning, or 8 in the morning to work on the machine. And since I'm sleeping there, I would have to get up 15 minutes before that, clear all my stuff out of the way, and maybe go sleep in my car. But then he wouldn't even show up when he said he was going to. So it was all for nothing. I had my sleep interrupted for that. And then I go sleep in an uncomfortable car. But here's where it gets really surreal. Let's say he did that. I say, I'm going to be here at 7 to work on the machine until 9, then you can open at 9. So 6:45, I start getting ready. I get in my car sleeping. He doesn't even show up until 8:15. But remember what I said before. First thing he sees are the trucks lined up on the other side of the building, waiting for us to open at 9. Oh my goodness! And he freaks out. Because once he sees it, it's suddenly relevant. The trucks were there the whole time, didn't mean anything. Every morning they're there. If he doesn't show up, he doesn't know it, no harm, no foul. But once his eyes see it, all of a sudden it becomes this urgent matter. So what's he do? Like 8:15 in the morning? Knocks on my car window, that big old creepy smile of his. Hey, you want to punch in early? There's trucks out there waiting. You want to open early today? Huh? So what he wanted me to do was, after I got displaced the first time, had my sleep interrupted, then I go out here, get a few winks, and then he interrupts me again with that knock, which I associate at this point with the police, because they're the ones who knock on my window. And for $9 an hour, or maybe $11 an hour, he wants me to get up 45 minutes early, have no breakfast, don't even brush your teeth, literally go from sitting in this car dreaming about hopefully a beautiful woman, 120 seconds later being out there with a power washer getting mud and grease and grime shot down my throat. That's the kind of exploitation I had to deal with. And again, it wasn't necessarily he's trying to exploit me as a homeless person, it's that he was out of control. He couldn't grasp the obvious. Those trucks were there to wait for us to open at 9. He didn't have to open early. But these are the kinds of things that happened all the time. So there's a good example of how that interfered with both the business, because opening early, the truckers would get on the CB and start saying, yeah, they open at 8 o'clock today. And then the word gets out that we open at 8. So what do you get? Then you get a line of trucks out there who expect us to open at 8. Bad for business, because we open at 9. Meanwhile, he's disrupting my sleep. And so he simultaneously wants me to get less sleep and more work that day. For what? I'm going to get paid an extra $7 that day. And I usually end up staying late anyway. So it wouldn't have just been 9 hours. I probably would have got 12 hours that day. So it's just incomprehensible lack of empathy and sensitivity to other people. Meanwhile, he's bragging and boasting of how much he's doing for me by letting me stay there and giving me a job. But all he was doing with things like that was interfering with my ability to sleep, to get any kind of rest, to think straight, to not just be on fight or flight mode all the time because I'm worried about someone waking me up. Every time I shut my eyes, I have to worry about someone waking me up in the rudest manner imaginable, either inside the truck wash or in my car. It's no way to do business, and it was no way to help me get out of homelessness. He would not accept facts, verifiable facts, again, unless it behooved him to do it. So he had a real jealousy of people who had like accomplishments. So for example, if I tried to show a video of my band from back when I was in San Diego, the music video we made that got on the British version of MTV, or anything, I've written 3 books, and any kind of accomplishment, he would just kind of just blow it. He wouldn't be rude, but he'd just be like, yeah, that's interesting. No big deal. But then if you come along with something like, I had a picture of me shaking Michael Moore's hand, and then all of a sudden he's like, you met Michael Moore? So, all these things I actually did that I accomplished meant nothing. But then he sees my hand shaking Michael Moore's hand, and he, what he's doing is he's ignoring my accomplishments, and he's transferring it over to being impressed with Michael Moore's accomplishments. And he didn't like Michael Moore, don't get me wrong, but you see what he's doing? It's an insult. And I don't like Michael Moore. That handshake... That handshake didn't mean anything, believe me. I am not proud of that at all. It was the fishiest, clammiest handshake I've ever had, but that was a horrible experience for me. I did not enjoy that encounter at all. But just based on that photo, but you see what I'm going for. He would deliberately play down your accomplishments, but if he could belittle or humiliate you, the implication is that, well, Michael Moore is far more impressive and important and accomplished than you are. And yeah, Michael Moore built this little mini empire, but I don't think he did it in an ethical way personally, and I would be ashamed if I had done what Michael Moore did. So, but this kind of thing came up all the time. He was very belittling and abusive and insulting. But when it came to facts, I could not convince him of facts if he didn't want to hear it, because it was like he was insulted or jealous if I knew something he didn't. So, for example, he's talking about soaps and he's talking about chemistry, and he can't tell the difference between atoms and molecules. You know, that's not something I'm going to be able to explain to him because he knows everything and I don't, right? And for someone who's studied science his whole life, again, that's like intellectual nails on a chalkboard. Hearing someone who can't tell the difference between an atom and a molecule. Or he's just so out of focus, he's so hyperactive in his mind that he confuses the two by accident, but he can't figure out that he's confused the two even though he knows the difference. Who knows what the real answer is, but you get my point. Likewise, he couldn't... The one thing that he did let me do for him was the website. But he couldn't do things like, he couldn't tell the difference between a URL and a website. So he couldn't tell the difference between the domain name and the website. For example, if you go to Google, you type in google.com, that's the URL, that's the domain name, it's the address. Once typing that into your browser takes you to the website, which is software and hardware and algorithms. That's what draws the Google logo and the search box. That's what has all the search algorithms in the database. You see the difference? The difference is, and I could explain it this clearly and Mr. H would not get it. Okay, the domain name is like 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The website is like the White House. One is the address of how to get there, the other one is the physical location that is there. Mr. H couldn't get that. He couldn't figure it out. And he would fight me tooth and nail and try to get me to do things that were counterproductive and frankly just plain logically impossible. Because he wouldn't listen when I would explain verifiable facts to him. Alright, so I mentioned a moment ago about how he refused to market because, as he put it, most small businesses fail because of too much business. So my whole background in revenue management and marketing, out the window. He wasn't going to let me do it. And I'll talk about that later when we talk about marketing. But you have to be aware that that was an issue. It's one of the reasons he had no profit. Oh boy. Jeez, do I want to get into this one? Okay. I have to say this one because it's so important, but it's a long story, so I'm going to go through it really short and hopefully not too short. Because what he was doing to me was starting to really over time agitate me in a major way. It was the heart beating fast, the constant interruptions, sleep deprivation, the constant lying, the constant inaccurate. I couldn't rely on anything he said. I'll be there at 7 and he doesn't show up till 9. My whole environment was absolute chaos because of this guy, and I was getting increasingly feeling this fight or flight mode to the point where I got to the point after about 6 months at least, maybe 5 months, where just being in his presence, it's a lot like I hear other people describe being around like an abuser or someone who raped them. That's how I was feeling just being around my boss. I mean, this guy, like I said, he was terrifying me toward the end. This guy is not... I'm not here to insult him, but I think you can see. I've got enough problems being homeless. No privacy or anything. I've got a guy watching me, maybe with some popcorn. You see where I'm going with this. Anyway, so it started getting to the point where I started having what you could only call anxiety or panic attacks because of him and his treatment of me. That ain't the way I usually work. That's not normal for me. I'm the old guy who was in Skywarn and emergency management. If the whole town just blew over, I go out there, there could be bodies laying everywhere. Of course, I never had that happen, but I mean, I know myself well enough. I get out there and I don't freak out and go, oh my gosh, it's just a nightmare, oh my... You know, like on 9/11, I didn't freak out on 9/11. I'm one of these people who says, all right, here's the situation. We got to do this, we got to do that, we got to do this, and you just start working on it. And there will come a time when you decompress and you cry, but you've got things to do. That's the way I normally am. This guy had me reduced down to just a bucket of nerves, just literally shaking when he's around. And I was having anxiety and panic attacks. So I had one of these, and he saw them as outbursts. You know, because again, it always has to be someone else's fault. It can't be him. You know, so he saw it as like some kind of temperament problem on my part. He had somehow benefited from some self-help thing from 1950s. So after one of these anxiety, panic attacks. He, was upset with me because of that, because he doesn't like that kind of response to the way he treats people. He wants to dominate and control people. And he brought in this, it's called Dr. Lowe, Abraham Lowe, from the 1950s, and it's just a bunch of self-help psychobabble, and the guy's talking about the will and temper and things like this. Mr. H comes in, he brings the book, and he has a checklist with a bunch of very personal statements on it. Remember, he gets very personal. And he says, I want you to check the things on this checklist that apply to you. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do this. These are very personal, and I am sick of giving this guy personal information. He is a dangerous person to give that to. So I read through it, and I figure out what he probably expects me to check, so I check a couple of them just to get it out of the way. I give it to him, then he pulls me into his office and he says, okay, based on this checklist, I want you to read these chapters. And Jethro's out there working all by himself, washing these trucks. I'm on the clock, and I'm in the office reading a 60-year-old self-help book. This is not what I go to work for. And the reason I had this meltdown in the first place is because of the horrifying treatment I get from Mr. H. This is eventually what got me out of there. In the end, I had one of these panic attacks, and I couldn't take it anymore. And I told him, I said, I cannot, I told him flat out for the first time, I said, I will not take this treatment from you anymore, period. I promised you I'd give you 2 weeks notice when I started working here. I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. 2 weeks from now, I'm out of here. And I was so, my heart was beating so hard. This guy had just driven me to the point, just to the brink. And I honestly was worried about having a heart attack. I just wanted to leave and go to the doctor. So I give him 2 weeks notice, and what's he do? The next business day, he terminates me. That way you don't have to pay unemployment or take responsibility for the way you've abused, horribly abused, a very desperate employee for many months. A guy who's homeless. That's the kind of guy you're dealing with. But anyway, in this one case where he brought me this Dr. Lowe book, on the clock, while Jethro was working by himself, I'm sitting in there reading a self-help book, which I don't care about. I've studied self-help, I've studied cults, I've studied rhetoric and propaganda. I don't need this. I need to work in an environment with professionals who know what they're doing and who don't abuse other people. Extraordinary teams, that's what I need, not working with this guy. That's what I needed. But I had to humor him because, again, I was basically an indentured servant. So I read these 2 chapters. They weren't that long, and he's trying to tell me, oh, it's really complicated. It was just academic lingo. It wasn't complicated. It was basically baloney. It's the same stuff you usually get in self-help. And so he asked me what I thought of it. And I can't really tell him exactly what I thought. And I said, well, obviously this is derived from, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. With the will, this is derived from that school of thought that led to Hitler and the Nazis. And Mr. H and he got this horrified look on his face. He'd never heard of Schopenhauer. He didn't know anything about Nietzsche. He almost certainly didn't know what Triumph of the Will was, the great Nazi documentary film. The whole point of the Nazi Party was reestablishing this national identity and pride in oneself through sheer force of will. That's descended from the Arthur Schopenhauer and Nietzsche schools, more or less. Not getting into philosophy, but Mr. H didn't even know what I was talking about. So he's having me read this self-help book from some guy who no one's even heard of for the last half century. I know where it came from, the psychosocial basis of this. These guys were opposed to Freud and that kind of thing. He didn't even know anything about it, and yet he's the guy who walks around believing he's a know-it-all. It was just, why am I dealing with this at work? I'm in my workplace. This kind of nonsense shouldn't be going on, but that's just one example of the kind of just craziness I had to deal with this guy. So I'm going to skip ahead now, even though I'm going to skip a lot of stuff. But I want to get to that Alex Jones thing, if I can find it here. Remember, I said the one person I feel that he resembled more than anyone was Alex Jones. Not because of conspiracy theories and all that, although he had a few pretty bizarre ideas, but that wasn't his gig. If you know Alex Jones, he's a loudmouth, pushy, aggressive, talk show host who's built a little mini empire by using cult building tactics to build a cult of personality. And anyway, I'll describe, this is what the two of them have in common, Mr. H and Alex Jones. And I want you to picture Alex Jones, if you know who he is, and understand that's what I was dealing with as my boss in a physical labor environment. Okay? They're both hyperactive with no ability to focus on anything. They just go from one topic to another, just changing on a dime, like a UFO in the sky, just 90 degrees. Hyperactive. So much so that you start to feel it viscerally when you're around them. Those people who enter the room and they're just in some totally different reality. Now in Jones's case, he's doing it deliberately, I think. Well, it's his nature, but it has a manipulative effect on people. It's kind of like mesmerizing. Anyway, this isn't about Alex Jones. This is about Mr. H. They're dominating while constantly claiming to be a servant. So they have this fake humility. You know, I'm just saying the facts here. You know, that's the way Alex Jones talks all the time. You know, I'm just. You know, he's always saying I'm just and trying. But they're absolutely, totally dominating. It's his cult of personality. Not all of the people who are part of his cult, his bloggers and all that with Alex Jones. He's the man. Same thing here. Mr. H is the man. Savior complex. Mr. H had a savior complex. He portrayed himself, boasted about how much he's doing for me because I'm homeless, even though he's destroying my life in the process. Alex Jones is always out there. Now he does it with this fake humility, but he has this savior complex. He portrays himself as if I'm the only media that tells the truth, and you know, I was saying that years ago, and I predicted 9/11, and you know, he's just, you know, it's as if you're supposed to build an idol to Alex Jones and bow down before it. That's the way Mr. H was. They both claim to know everything. You can't tell them something, and when they vet information, they can't do it. They can't vet their sources. Look up on YouTube, Bill Cooper, Alex Jones, Y2K. Alex Jones did a show on the year 2000. Remember, this was when the Y2K problem was supposed to bring everything down. It was just a fake scare. That's another story. But Alex Jones on his radio show was saying things like nuclear power plants are melting down and there's tanks rolling through the streets of Austin, Texas, and you know, the Russians are preparing to launch nuclear missiles. He on his radio show, he's describing in real time like World War III, and yet nothing's happening in the real world. He scared the crap out of a whole bunch of people. They're running for the hills. And you can listen to it yourself. And yet 16 years later, this guy still has a little empire. That when you build a little cult of personality, even reality doesn't get in the way. That's the way Alex Jones is, right? He lies. I don't know any other way to put it. He just blatantly lies. Oh, we got the documents right here. You know, you never see the documents. You can't vet the documents. You can't check the sources. Look it up. Google it. Look it up on Google. That's what Alex Jones does. Same thing Mr. H did. He knew everything, but if you ever even tried to research anything he's saying, he was usually full of crap, whether he's talking about history or science or business. They both talk constantly and aggressively, just in your face and not letting you get a word in. They're always thinking of what to say next instead of listening to you. They interrupt all the time. Listen to any interview from Alex Jones. I mean, he'll ask a question very aggressively, very loudly, very longly, and when the person he's interviewing finally gets to give their answer, you know, calmly, and they're trying to focus and make points and give examples and back up what they're saying with facts, and Alex will just blatantly interrupt them and go on to some totally different subject. He just doesn't care what they're saying. It's all about Alex Jones. Well, it's all about Mr. H at this place. They both say whatever they need to say at any given time, so they contradict each other, walking contradictions. They're always boasting of how great they are, often in a fake, humble way. But and they also both make really stupid suggestions to, quote, help other people. I just gave you an example. Mr. H with this Dr. Lowe, which he didn't even realize came from the same school of thought that helped lead to the Nazi Party. Alex Jones is out there like trying to sell gold and colloidal silver, and I mean, I mean, just monumentally stupid suggestions to help their people. Mr. H would say, I know that, even if he didn't know that, because maybe I just told him and it was the first time it had ever been publicly said in the history of the world. But I know that kind of thing. Alex Jones is always doing that. I know that. I was saying that 3 years ago. Never get any proof, but he can say it because he has the microphone. But ultimately, the thing that really makes these two guys seem similar to me, Alex Jones and Mr. H, is that they're just both embarrassing buffoons. I'm embarrassed to be seen around Mr. H. I mean, literally, when he was there and he's doing his blah, 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 talking drivers' heads off and BSing people and just his behavior and the lying and everything, it was so creepy. I was just totally embarrassed to even be seen around the guy. And you know what? If I'm ever out in public and anything, I'm on YouTube and anything comes up from Alex Jones, because they always, because people who know what Alex Jones is are going to avoid it, so often they put different titles on there so you don't know what it is till you get there. And it comes up and I see that InfoWars thing and I'm just like, I don't want anybody seeing me watching this crap. It's the same thing with Mr. H. And here's the one thing that they really ultimately have in common. They're full of sound and fury and they signify nothing. For all of Mr. H's hyperactive running around, hyperactive talking, just jumping from one thing to another, asking questions, blah, 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 all this stuff that has my heart beating fast. For all of Alex Jones out there with a bullhorn, the New World Order's gonna eat your baby, blah, blah. For all that stuff, neither one has accomplished anything. Nothing. I'm sure Jones will try to take credit for Trump winning the election or something, but they have done nothing. Alex Jones hasn't changed anything. The New World Order, whatever that is out there as strong as it ever was. They haven't changed anything. Nothing has changed. And so you got to imagine, if you know who Alex Jones is, imagine working for someone with that personality type and that hyperactive mode of operating, and apply his competence at defeating the New World Order to competence at running a truck wash. That's what I was dealing with for 7.5 months. And it took me the first couple months to figure out that's what I was dealing with. Alright. Let's see if there's anything else. There is one other thing I want to mention, at least one other thing here. The way that Mr. H was so abusive and insulting, and he did it in what he thought were clever ways, but again, I've studied rhetoric and propaganda, manipulative language, linguistics, junk science. I've studied the way people manipulate each other through interpersonal social interactions since the late 80s. I did it applied to junk science because I'm very offended by junk science. Very. Science is such a beautiful thing. When people hijack it to put money in their pocket or to pursue a political or social agenda, I can't take it. I fought against that my entire adult life, but I learned all these tactics, and Mr. H would use these tactics expecting them to work on me, and they didn't. I had to kind of fake it because I didn't have any choice. Like I said, if I could have, I would have left this place long ago. But I couldn't. And frankly, when I did leave this place and I gave my 2 weeks, I had just had enough. I couldn't then either. That's why I'm in this car in peril of dying as the winter comes around. So here's the thing. When you think about how abusive this guy really was, and that's exactly what it was. It was abusive in the classic sense. I wanted to read you a quote. This is from a podcast, actually nuclear, I forget what it's called, nuclear, oh no, it's a anti-nuclear power podcast. I can't believe it. I don't remember the name of it. I didn't put it down here. But the woman who runs the podcast, she gives a good quote about the way Mr. H is. So let me just go through this quote. Now, it starts out on a different topic. It starts out talking about nuclear power, but it brings it home. So I'm quoting from the podcast now. Now, here's a perfect example of the nuclear industry's revolving door. Dale Klein, former head of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a government agency, and current head of the Nuclear Reform Monitoring Committee, an industry lobbying group, revolving door, who was hired by Fukushima nuclear power plant operator TEPCO, described the situation at Fukushima as challenging. So in other words, this guy who was once the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, now he's joined a lobbying group through the revolving door, making a lot more money, revolving door, like the student loan industry and the Department of Education, revolving door, money in your pocket, that kind of thing. This guy comes out, now that he represents nuclear power interest, he says the Fukushima meltdown is challenging. Quoting Klein, eventually, Klein told ABC News, that water must be treated to reduce its radioactivity and then dumped into the ocean. He went on to say, so there's no risk to public health and safety, but it's an emotional issue. End of quote. And then this is what the podcaster commented. There it is. That's the talking point they have been and they're going to repeatedly push. Radiation is not unhealthy. You are emotional. And that's what's creating the problem. That's what perpetrators do. They blame the victims for responding in a rational way to abuse. And she's absolutely right. Another way to put it in one sentence only, I saw on a comment on a YouTube video, quote, it takes a special kind of asshole to blame the victim, unquote. If you recall, the reason I ended up leaving that job in a huff, giving my 2 weeks notice, in which case he didn't even let me finish up the 2 weeks. He just went ahead and fired me. The reason for that is because he had driven me to the brink of insanity with this horrifying treatment. Everything from watching me sleep from 40 miles away to constantly coming in while I'm sleeping, interrupting, to belittling me, insulting me, doing all these things. He's blaming the victim. Same thing they're doing with Fukushima. Same thing any abuser does. They blame the person. Someone's abused and they respond in what is a perfectly natural way to being abused like that, and then they blame them for that. That's what Mr. H did with me. That's what he did with the contractors. That's what he did with the drivers. That's what he does with everyone. He's an abusive person. And yet, he boasts of being the next best thing to a savior figure. Now, I hope you recognize with all that I've said about Mr. H, you cannot do business that way. That is how not to do business. And the reason I gave you so much information about this, again, is because he is the business. He's the owner, and he has nominally 2 employees whose jobs are to wash trucks. This individual I just described is the business for what it's worth. So the reason the business is failing, it isn't just deliberate on his part because he didn't want to turn a profit. Why are his employees suffering? Why are his contractors suffering? Why are his customers suffering? He is so incompetent at running a business. Even though he went to business school, everybody he's touching is getting hurt. So hopefully now you really understand why this truck wash is a perfect example of how not to do business. And with that, I'm going to end this part of the introduction. And in part 4, I'm going to list out the initiatives that I took as a $9 an hour or $11 an hour truck washer. And you're going to see how I initiated things, a long list of things, at a truck wash that were on par with what I did when I was sitting in the office with presidents of multinational corporations. And yet, the business is failing because Mr. H wanted nothing to do with it, and I'm still living in a car. And if that doesn't show how unjust all of this is, I don't know what will. So, Thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to having you join me for the next one. As always, please subscribe, comment, leave your experiences down there so we can all learn from each other in this. Tell other people about this channel, and remember, I'm doing this in large part to get donations, suggestions, encouragement, anything, job offers, something that'll help me so I don't have to live in this car anymore as Minnesota winter begins. Tomorrow is when the snow begins. With that, I'll let you go for this episode. Thank you so much for watching.